Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's talk, which is up on screen and with Paul Varotsis. When we get to the end of the presentation, we'll come off screen and we can be able to see everybody, and we'll have some questions and answers discussion, whatever emerges from the talk. So thanks ever so much indeed, and it's great to see everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that our first talk is by Paul Varotsis, and it looks to be an exciting talk. There's plenty that went on with this individual's life, as I understand, but I'm sure we'll hear all about it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul himself, and we can start this afternoon's presentation. Thanks ever so much, Paul. Over to you.
Can you hear me, Duncan? And can you see the top screen, the first slide?
Yes, we can see the first slide, and we can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. In terms of introductions, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a former banker and asset manager who made a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in geology. So I got myself a degree in geology, worked a bit at the Natural History Museum, failed a PhD, was a treasurer for a while for the Natural History Museum, Franz in Paris, and then for the Geologists Association, and a general fan of geology and in particular paleontology. In terms of this afternoon's talk, it's Baron Franz Nopcsa. This is the second slide. Hope everybody can see it. I bumped into Baron Nopcsa while working on an assignment on the island of Gargano. Gargano is this island in the spur in the Italian boot, in green there. At the end of the Miocene, it was an island that had some weird and wonderful animals, including deer with 5 antlers and enormous hedgehogs and lots of weird and wonderful island creatures. While I was studying this island, I discovered that there was a guy who had discovered the first fossil island. I didn't know it was a thing. Turns out it's pretty difficult to discover fossil islands. And there was this Austro-Hungarian baron who had discovered the very first fossil island. Not only that, but he discovered the one that existed at the late Cretaceous, which is pretty difficult because obviously it's further back in time. The island he discovered is the island of HOGG, which is today in the middle of Romania. It's the green bit that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. It's rolling hills, full of wildlife. But at the time of the Cretaceous, it was a tropical island in what was the European archipelago. So I was really puzzled and intrigued by Baron Nopcsa, and I started digging in to discover more of his life. And as I discovered more, I was very impressed by him, and I was kind of saddened that he wasn't all that well known, even though he has quite a fascinating life. So I'll take you through what I've learned through my studies. First of all, my main sources. I transcribed Nopcsa's correspondence with the British Museum from 1904 to 1933. Pretty much everything he's sent, as well as looked at his collections. But I've also used Robert Elsey, who's a Canadian scholar who studied his work in Albania, as well as a couple of works by David Weishampel, one a book on Transylvanian dinosaurs, as well as the biography of Nopcsa that was translated from Hungarian into English in his paper of 2013. I'd like to give my sincere thanks to the Natural History Museum, obviously, for their help, and in particular to Paul Barrett, who allowed me to have access to all these documents, as well to Gareth Dyke, who works at the University of Debrecen, who helped me with quite a bit of the background in Romania and Hungary. First of all, our friend Nopcsa was a man of many languages and many names. He spoke a number of languages, including German, Romanian, Hungarian, what he refers to as Slavic, which we would call Serbo-Croatian these days. Various Albanian languages. Albania at the time was a bunch of very high mountains with various valleys, and in each valley pretty much they spoke a different sort of Albanian. English, of course. He had an English governess, as one does, and he published in French and Italian. He's worked in many places, from Vienna to London and from Budapest to Moscow. And he also went by a number of names. I've given you the names down there, from German to Hungarian to French to English. And every time he'd obviously translate his name, which when you try to do research doesn't necessarily always help. But here you go. And here he is on the right of your screen, as he looked like in his early 20s, dressed in Albanian costume. He was, by all accounts, a character. Tilly Anninger, who was a paleontologist who actually met him and worked with him, called him a genius and a mental case. Gert Hobel, who was his German biographer, said his ingenious intuition was in stark contrast to his inability to understand and appreciate the motives of others. His insensitivity and egoism were in contrast to his devotion to the Albanians, and his critical intelligence to his emotional bias. So here you go. He was a character and he looked the part. We'll start our story on the 25th of April, 1933 at Zingerstrasse number 12. It's the picture on the right. That morning, Nopcsa wakes up, prepares the tea for his companion, Bayazit Elmas Doda. They've been together for close to 30 years. Gives Doda his tea. Doda drinks it, and after 5 or 10 minutes falls asleep. Nopcsa gets up, takes his gun, and shoots him twice through the temple. Then goes back into his office, takes care of a number of papers, and commits suicide. So that's the end of a kind of a glamorous and fascinating life that kind of went on with a bang. And if you read the Vienna newspapers the next day, here's a title in one of the papers, Bloody Drama in Zingerstrasse. I've taken some sentences from those. That financial motives may also have been involved, can be deduced not only from the testimony of his maid, who had not received her salary for 4 months, and from the fact that Franz Nopcsa, who was devoted to his books and collections, had been planning to sell off his extensive library containing many a unique volume. In a letter left to the police, he stated, the motive for my suicide is a nervous breakdown. The reason that I shot my longtime friend and secretary, Mr. Bayazit Elmas Doda, in his sleep without his suspecting is that I did not wish to leave him behind, sick, in misery, and without a penny, because he would have suffered too much. I wish to be burnt. Burnt was actually the word used in German. Some of this actually has been questioned as to whether Bayazid would have lived without a penny, but we'll come to that later on. Going back to his family, he came from an aristocratic family in Romania. There are documents relating to his family in Romania dating to the 12th century. Nopcsa actually literally means knight in Romanian. He had a family crest, and you can see it at the top, that showed an arm holding a sword with the head of a Turk. So it shows you the kind of fighting spirit of the family. But in the late 18th, early 19th century, this kind of this family that was pretty much in the back of all of Austro-Hungarian's history suddenly made it big. And we had the first Baron, who was Nopcsa's great uncle, and in particular his uncle, who held the exact same name as Baron Nopcsa, Franz Baron Nopcsa. who was first Lord Chancellor to Empress Sisi, the famous Empress Sisi, and also a noted botanist. He's the one who, after Nopcsa obtained his PhD, gave him some money to allow him to travel, and that's how he discovered the Balkans and kind of fell in love with the Balkans and its inhabitants. And finally, we've got a picture of his dad, Elek Nopcsa, who died in 1918, who was quite a bit younger than his uncle. They were actually sons of two different mothers. His world was very different from ours. This is the world he grew up in. As you can see, it's a world of empires. I'd like to draw your attention on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, obviously one that doesn't exist anymore. The red arrow points to Atsek, which is where the family castle and lands are. And the other red arrow to Scutari, which is this city on the side of a lake in Albania, where he would spend a lot of his time. For Austria-Hungary, the Adriatic was a crucial part of its military structure. Its fleet, because obviously Austria-Hungary had a fleet, as you may remember from The Sound of Music, was based in Trieste. And in order for this fleet to go anywhere, they had to actually go all the way down the Adriatic. And anybody who controlled Albania controlled the Adriatic. So Austria-Hungary was particularly interested in actually getting control of Albania. Obviously, they weren't alone. Italy as well was interested. So as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, a number of European powers are trying to grab whatever would fall on their lap and to control the new countries that would come as a result of that. This is Nopcsa's castle. At the top, the one with the antlers, what it looked like at the time when Nopcsa was alive. And you can see it looked very elegant and probably a bit too many antlers for my taste, but here you go. And then you can see pictures of what it looked like in the late 90s. When the communists took over Romania, they destroyed a lot of what used to be the Nopcsa's family's castles, and in particular, the library was all the books were burnt, and according to local law, it took more than 3 days of burning to burn all the books in the Nopcsa family estate, which is rather sad, of course, but here you go. At the bottom, you've got what the castle looks like now. It has been restored in the last couple of years. So it's a bit over the top, but here you go. I guess that's part of the restoration effort. He had a brother and a sister. His brother Elek was 2 years younger, and his sister Ilona was about 5 years younger. Here you see them. And he was sent to school at the Theresianum, which was the place you'd send young aristocrats to learn the ways. His dad and uncle had gone to Theresianum before him. So he went, and Theresianum was, of course, in Vienna. And while he was studying at Theresianum in his last year of high school, in substance, his sister, during his holidays, his sister discovered these bones in the estates. So he took the bones and brought them to Vienna, and he showed them to Dr. Edward Seuss, no less, who was the top geologist at the time in Vienna, who is someone extremely important. He gave us names like Gondwana and Tethys. And remember, at the time, dinosaurs were not all that common. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can you hear me properly, Duncan?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, excellent. So dinosaurs were not all that. There weren't all that many dinosaur fossils in Europe. In substance, there were the few that had been discovered in the UK. There were the one discovered in Belgium, but anywhere in Eastern Europe, there wasn't a single dinosaur. So Zeus was extremely impressed, and he said, "We'll send you a representative of the university to come and study your fossils." So Nopcsa went back to his estates and waited, and after a while, having not heard from Vienna, went back to Vienna to see Zeus, and Zeus told him, "Look, why don't you do it yourself?" And that's what he did. But obviously, he did it the Nopcsa way. That is, that these days would expect a person to actually study for a PhD with a supervisor, spend time with them, and take classes, whatever else. Not at all. What he did is that he used his network of all the aristocracy he knew, all the people he got involved with, and as a baron of the empire, he had access to all the libraries and all the people he needed. And he studied, and he did it very quickly. And by the time he was 22, he was a doctor. Here is his thesis: fossils of Transylvania. The main one you can see is a fossil of what he at the time named Limnosaurus, but later changed to Telmatosaurus. Limnosaurus had already been taken. And he was extremely proud and possibly full of himself, to the point that he wrote to Louis Dolo, who was the great man of dinosaurs in Europe at the time, "Isn't it wonderful that a man as young as me wrote such an excellent memoir?" His scientific circle was quite different from what we would expect these days. On the left, you've got his professor, Edward Zeus, I mentioned earlier, who was really a geologist, not a paleontologist. While he was studying with Zeus, one of his assistants was named Othenio Abel. Othenio became a noticed paleontologist. He's considered one of the founding fathers of paleobiology. But if you look closely, you'll see that he's got little swastikas on his buttons. He was a noted Nazi. He became rector of the Vienna University and was retired because he allowed violence against Jews and Catholics on the university campus, and only came back to become rector after the Nazis took over Austria. So he was quite a character, but remained quite close to Nopcsa. Obviously, that was before Nazism had taken over Germany, but that kind of gives you an idea of the individual. Then we've got Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, who you might know from the fossil Piltdown scandal, but he was a very fine and a very good paleontologist who, at the time, was famous for his fossil fishes. He's an eminent paleontologist who, unfortunately, whose reputation has suffered from the whole Piltdown scandal. Friedrich von Huene, who became pretty much the dinosaur man of Europe in the early 20th century, was also very close to Nopcsa. Nopcsa would visit him throughout his life, and they were of the same generation and very close. Finally, Louis Dolo, and I mentioned earlier, was probably the most famous paleontologist at the time based in Europe, and who was known for having discovered the Bernisite iguanodons. And outside paleontology, we've got Wegener. Alfred Wegener, who was not a geologist or a paleontologist, who was an astronomer and a climatologist, who developed the theory of continental drift, and who unfortunately published it in 1915, right in the middle of the war, in German. And as a result, the theory kind of was considered as completely wrong and unwelcome until the 1950s or 60s. Finally, a quote from Louis Dolo, referring to Nopcsa. He said, "A comet crossing our paleontological sky, spreading a kind of diffuse light." Coming from Dolo, it's particularly interesting is that he didn't actually like Nopcsa, but he was obviously very impressed by him. All of this at this time, the general views on paleontology and biology were marked by Lamarckism, neo-Lamarckism. Pretty much, Darwin had died less than 20 years earlier, and Wallace was still alive. But despite all that, science had moved on and ignored to a large extent Darwin, and really was based to a large extent on the inheritance of acquired characters. And to a large extent, Nopcsa followed that, followed by orthogenesis, which is another theory based on the fact that evolution actually has a direction as opposed to going in whichever direction it takes. So this is his scientific circle. As a young man, he loved to read novels by Karl May. This is probably the best German author you've never heard of. Karl May was the guy who wrote novels similar to Tintin in France, I guess, about young men having adventures in exotic places, whether it's the Balkans or America, and they would actually go into exotic places, have guns and shoot and have fun. He spent his childhood reading Karl May, and pretty much his life was based on his reading and what he found exciting. In 1903, after he got his PhD and his uncle gave him some money, he went to Constantinople, and there he met Louis Draskovic. Louis Draskovic was another Austro-Hungarian aristocrat, 2 years older than Nopcsa. They pretty much fell in love and traveled from Constantinople back to Austria through the Balkans, having great adventures on horseback and discovering the Balkans. In a letter to Arthur Smith Woodward, he writes, "You will be very shocked when you read the following lines, but I feel obliged to inform you that my arrival in London has had to be postponed for an uncertain period since I fell in love." Well, obviously he fell in love with Draskovic, but also, fortunately, not a dark-eyed Turkish or Albanian beauty, in which case I might have to fear fiercely armed rivals, but with the geology of the country. And he would spend the following years really studying and getting to know Albania. One of his close friends, Kalman Lambrecht, who Nopcsa actually appointed librarian at the Royal Hungarian Geological Institute, says that he knew no rules of life and gave nothing to propriety. In every way, he knew he stood high above the people. His sexual life took strong fluctuation that determined many of his actions. And the person who would be central to his life would be this man, Bayezid Elmas Doda, on the 20th of November 1906. And this is Nopcsa's own notebooks. I met Bayezid Doda. Since that time, Bayezid has been with me, and since the death of Louis Draskovic, he has been the only person who has truly loved me and in whom I had full confidence, never doubting for a moment that he would misuse my trust. He, of course, had his failings, but I was more than willing to put up with them. The Serbs murdered Bayezid's father and brother in 1913 out of hatred for everything Austro-Hungarian, and in particular out of hatred for me, because I was active in Albania. Now, they meet in Bucharest in 1906. Nopcsa is 28, Doda is 17, and pretty much they will never part from that moment on. On the right-hand side, you've got the village of Stirovica in what is now North Macedonia, but at the time it was considered Albania. This village does not exist because during the Balkan Wars, the Serbs pretty much burnt it to the ground because of Doda's close links with Nopcsa. One touching point is that on the left-hand side, you've got a fossil of Kibotian bayazidi, which is a turtle that Nopcsa discovered and named after his friend. It literally means the beautiful box of Bayazid, and it's a fossil turtle he named in his honor. Interestingly enough, less than a month after they met in Bucharest, he writes, to Smith Woodward, who was a keeper of geology at the NHM. I'm sorry, at the time it was called British Museum. And he writes that pretty much he would like Smith Woodward to find him some rooms where he could stay with his what he calls the Albanian schoolmaster. And he explains with much detail that he would be very unwilling to leave his servant away, and he would very much like him to stay at home with him. That's where he stayed at the top at 22 Bullingham Mansions in Westminster. And these are some of Doda's actual pictures. He was a photographer, and he took a number of pictures of the Balkans throughout their travels. Some are absolutely beautiful. This is Skopje, and you've got a contingent of the Turkish army there. He traveled throughout Albania, and you have to imagine Albania in the early 20th century a bit more akin to Papua New Guinea than to a European nation. Every single valley would have its own tribe, that would have its own language, and whose code of honor was a lot more important than anything to do with state or law. On the left-hand side, you've got the links between the different Albanian tribes. It was all based on honor and blood feuds. And you could see how this family tree and the feuds would actually go on forever. Nopcsa actually called the Albanians the armed children of Europe. And for example, he who kills for simple revenge must not be worried either by the sovereign or by the tribe. That was pretty much the way things went on in Albania, and he thought it was all dandy. And this is what some more images of the Albania he studied. Bear in mind also the agriculture was rather backwards. They didn't have potatoes. They didn't have deep tillage or crop fertilization. But he spent a lot of time studying the customs, the traditions, the languages, and of course, the geology. As you can see on this picture, there was plenty of geology to study because there's lots of mountains out there. But what's really interesting and fascinating is that he already was looking at this thing with an eye that maybe not had continental drift in mind, but that was the way he would look at it, which was ages ahead of its time. If today you look at the map of Albania, it's pretty much based on Nopcsa's original work. And here you can see his notebooks and a more recent map of Albania. He managed to get himself kidnapped by a highway robber, Mustaflita, who wanted £10,000 for his release, and then found a way, negotiated his way out of it. Of course, Doda got involved. There was all kind of discussions, escapes, you name it. It was really out of those teenager adventure books. Here's the castle of Prizren where he finally got released. But he would also play hide and seek with the Turkish authorities, who obviously didn't consider him as someone particularly good to have around. They figured he's an Austro-Hungarian spy who's trying to, and indeed, what he was doing was actually bringing weapons for the Albanians to get rid of the Ottomans. And here's an example of those. I am again in Albania, and I had quite exciting adventures with Turkish government, who sent 300 soldiers to take me prisoner for making notes and traveling, but failed. Send tank with spirits of alcohol, and I will return it with fish from Lake Scutari. So that's the postcard he sent to Arthur Smith Woodard in 1907, where he was barely 30-year-old. In this particular instance, the Turks did take 3 hostages, including brothers of one of his comrades. He managed at the end to free them, but it wasn't geology as you might be used to. It involved a lot of spying, a lot of soldiers, a lot of shooting, and here you go. In substance, he was known as the Austrian agitator. And here is a German historian and diplomat who wrote, "He was a gaunt man of middle size, very single-minded and clever, and he spoke Albanian as a native. He was especially generous with the distribution of ammunition, one of the most desired articles in Albania. In particular, he would actually travel through the borders disguised and carrying lots of ammunition and guns. And he would actually write to his friends and tell these stories. He did so well that Albania actually became independent. Here is a picture of the Congress of Trieste, who he actually organized, and you can see the guy with the mustache here on the left-hand side. That's Nopcsa, and on the right-hand side, you've got the prime minister of this new Albania. They all had met in Trieste at a congress organized by Nopcsa, and he actually wrote the final communique of this congress, with the intention of actually creating a new Albania. And during this Congress, he actually suggested to the foreign ministry that he get himself proclaimed King of Albania. Why not? In fact, in fairness, he was the only Austro-Hungarian there who actually spoke Albanian, who knew about Albania, who knew Albanians, and he actually knew how to deal with them. Interestingly enough, he said, "I would be willing to join the list of candidates for the throne if the foreign ministry would support me," and told him that to have myself proclaimed King of Albania. One interesting point is that he would actually suggest I would have no difficulty coming up with the further funds needed by marrying a wealthy American heiress aspiring to royalty. So he tried. In fairness, that didn't work out. It only lasted a couple of days, but you could see how on the left-hand side, you've got a picture of the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, Nopcsa, of course, and Ismail Gjimali, the Albanian prime minister. All this was happening under the Austro-Hungarian protection. But what was really important was not happening there. It was happening in London, when the powers got together and decided that Albania would indeed be an independent country. But the powers, i.e. Germany, France, and Britain, decided that it would be a German who would be the first king of Albania. And all this kind of happened outside what the Austro-Hungarians were trying to do. Coming back to his scientific work, Nopcsa came up with a number of innovations. He published more than 150 scientific papers in various languages. He was one of the very first ones to study sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs. When you look at his work these days, some of the dinosaurs are not quite of the same strata, so that's a bit of a problem. But the concept of looking at dinosaurs and trying to figure out to what extent you might have male and females as opposed to a new species was relatively new at the time. Looking at how to compare juveniles and grown-ups. He's very much considered as the father of paleophysiology. We'll come to that later on, but he started at looking fossils as whole animals and looking at the brain, how it was related, and how to look at endocasts, how to look at slides of the inside of bones, cranial nerves, musculatures, and even skin coloration. He looked at biomechanics, locomotion. He was pretty much looking at complete reconstruction of animals. And at the bottom, you see one of his drawings, probably not the most realistic one, but it shows how much he thought about what the animal actually looked like alive. As I said earlier, one of the things he's famous for is for discovering fossil islands. But the way he came about it was the dinosaurs he discovered around HOGG were notably smaller than the ones you'd find anywhere else. And not only that, but they looked kind of more antiquated. They didn't look like the animals of the late Cretaceous. So he came to the conclusion that the reason why these animals were there is because they actually lived in an island. And indeed, HOGG was an island. Since then, more fossils have been found in there, and the HOGG is confirmed as an island. But being able to do that in the early 20th century is quite a feat. He also, as I said earlier, looked at the inside of fossils. He would look at the histology of bones and was able to look at one particular dinosaur of North America and prove that it actually was a juvenile. He looked at thermoregulation, and he was particularly interested in glands and how they impact the animals. He also supported Huxley's view that the dinosaurs are in substance, that birds are in substance flying dinosaur. He actually wrote a couple of papers supporting that. And that, again, went against the grain in the earlier 20th century. Finally, he was a big fan of Wegener. Here's a letter he wrote to Hühne about the fact that reptiles in the Karoo was similar to the ones in Brazil, showing that continental drifts was a reality. And an extract of a letter he sent to Wegener himself, congratulating him on his finds. We're talking the 1920s, whereas the Vine-Matthews hypothesis was only confirmed in the 1960s. And on the right-hand side, you've got some drawings by Nopcsa of, in substance, subductions, which at the time was a complete no-no. When the World War started, he found himself joining the Austro-Hungarian army. He fought, but then he went back to Albania, tried again, and then failed to help Albania become, in substance, his country. So he left and never returned again, but continued to work for the Austro-Hungarian army in his lands, i.e. Transylvania, dressed up as Peter Gorlopan, a Romanian shepherd. And you can see a picture of him as a Romanian shepherd on the right-hand side. He wrote long reports to Vienna of what was going on the Romanian border. Unfortunately, his superior at the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Affairs turned out to be a spy himself, and that kind of destroyed his work. And then at the end of World War I, he found himself in Budapest. Budapest became one of the first Soviet republics outside Russia. And then, as you'd expect from our friend Nopcsa, became the first person to hijack a plane. What he did is that he just went to a plane with his gun and told the pilot to drive him to Vienna. And now he's known as the first plane hijacker. So not only a geologist, as you can see. Unfortunately, World War I was pretty much a disaster for Nopcsa and his family. Pretty much all of his lands were in what became Romania, and he pretty much lost it all. This is the world that came out of World War One. As you can see, it's a world of nation states as opposed to a world of empires. And if you compare this one with the previous map, you can see how different they are. So the post-war years were marked by a number of sad news for Nopcsa. His father died in 1918. He was a brother who had been married and died at 40. As I mentioned, Romania nationalized his properties. As a result, he had no revenue, so he couldn't really make a living. In 1920, he returns to Transylvania to claim his family castle, and he's beaten and left injured by the local farmers. He's in a terrible physical state, to the point that in 1927 he gets himself a Steinach operation. Now, Steinach operation was pretty much the Viagra of the time. Its aim was to reduce fatigue and the consequences of aging, and to increase overall vigor and sexual power in men. It consisted of unilateral vasectomy, which Steinach said would alter the balance between sperm production and increased hormone. Nopcsa was enthusiastic about this operation. Bear in mind that at the time, all these weird operations were kind of fashionable. As I said, it was the Viagra or the Botox of the time. At the same time, there were doctors who would actually implant monkey or goat testicles because that would actually help you. So it sounds outrageous, but here you go. That was the fashion of the time. He was forced to sell his collection to the Natural History Museum just to make a living, but his scientific production increased. Here are some examples of his collection at the NHM, as well as his handwriting. Some of his notebooks, and you can see at the bottom some of his slides that show the cells inside the fossil. He managed in 1925 to become a director of the Royal Hungarian Geological Institute. That's obviously through his contacts. He was pals with the Prime Minister of Hungary and had been kind of very close to a number of the politicians of Hungary. He did a number of great things for Hungarian geology. He organized publications, scientific meetings, in particular a meeting of the Paläontologische Gesellschaft in Budapest, where Tilly Edinger, who I mentioned earlier, was present. And she wrote, "We've only seen him once, our host once. He was pushed among us, lying in a wheelchair, paralyzed from head to toe. But he also behaved as he always did, that is, like a merciless autocrat, and he made a number of enemies, as a result of which he ended up resigning in 1929 and found himself with very little money." So what did he do? Instead of actually traveling throughout Europe in grand style, he bought himself a bike. And here he is on his motorbike, writing in a letter to Hühner. He said, "The reason I didn't come to Tübingen is that a bike is cheaper than train." So here he is. He recounts all kind of weird and wonderful stories where he'd actually, Doda would actually sit in the front of the bike and he would sit behind, and he'd tell all kind of stories about their various adventures up and down Europe. And that's when he actually went to Gargano, the island I mentioned in my introduction. So the end of his life was all kind of rather sad. Here's a caricature of him. I'm far too proud to be photographed now that I look like an old scarecrow. He had become really sad, but also extremely bitter with his enemies. At the same time, it appears that Doda seemed to have developed a kind of life of his own in Vienna, as he was known as Max the Albanian. And people generally refer to Nopcsa as der dumme Baron, which means the stupid baron. So there may have been more to them than appears. I don't know. It's kind of hard to look back at history, but it looks kind of interesting that they might have been gone apart. To finish up, I'd like to give you a little poem that he actually wrote to Arthur Smith Woodward. Hip, 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 hooray. I'm happy, delighted, and gay. I finally found the way to come to you someday. I'm coming to work as before to study those monsters of yore, those animals living no more that ran on the Wealden shore. It will be a pleasure to meet the splendid museum to see, like for a monkey to be high up in a coconut tree. So here you go. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy that, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Paul. That's fantastic. If you want to stop screen sharing, just to come out of the screen share.
Yep, hold on.
Thank you. That's absolutely wonderful. Almost an incredulous story, really. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you? I mean, he's clearly quite a mercurial character. And I do have a question or have a comment, but before that, I'm going to see if we've got anybody else from the floor. So, can people indicate, and most people are actually off screen, but I mean, just bring yourself back on video and put your hand up using the hand in the middle of the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, or wave if you come back on screen, and we can take some questions or comments. Dominic Davey.
That was a really interesting talk. I don't know how any of us could pick another character and make them more interesting than that was. I was just interested in his work in Albania before the First World War. How did people publish their material then? How did they publish, both in writing and drawing, but also the maps as well? Where have you found them?
Right. His map was published. He tried to first publish it through the Royal Geographical Society, but he did publish it at the end, and you could actually even, I think there've been the old one actually that was sold, one of his original maps of Albania. So I think that I saw some antiquarian in Vienna who was trying to sell one of his original maps. So yes, he published the map. In terms of his notebooks, they went through these weird. He tried to have them published and then changed them so many times that the publisher kind of lost hope. When he died, they all went to a friend of his who happened to be Jewish, and they disappeared as a result. And then some were found again. Believe it or not, they all ended up as the basis of the National Library of Albania, and you can find them at the National Library of Albania these days. So his notebooks are there, and they are very detailed. They were never actually published in their entirety as he originally intended, but a lot can be found, and a lot was actually published by the person I mentioned earlier on, who studied his Albanian, who's an albanologist, a Canadian albanologist who studied his writing.
Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Any other questions? John Milson. Unmute yourself and then. You're not unmuted yet. Oh, there we go, John. You are now.
Yeah. I was wondering what his Albania was, because I noticed that most of the places that he mentioned were actually in what we would now call Kosovo.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Obviously, Albania did not exist at the time. It was designed or created in 1913, and then promptly disappeared after during the war. As you know, that part of the world is a part that where the borders have changed repeatedly. So when I use Albania, and granted, places like Skopje, they're these days in North Macedonia. Bits that were not considered Albania was Montenegro, because Montenegro at the time was a separate country. But as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, what you call Albania was a rather elastic thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Dominic Davey again.
Yeah, sorry, it's a follow-up question to my previous one, which is you showed some material from the Natural History Museum, so fossils and drawings and notes, and I wondered if do they exist just in the archives of the Natural History Museum? They're not available elsewhere.
I used the stuff available at the NHM because that's where I was based.
Right.
There's a lot more. I got in touch with István Főzi at the Hungarian Natural History Museum, who actually mentioned to me a number of things. The problem is that being in Hungarian, I couldn't help all that much. This would need to be translated for me. So there is material there. When I went with, I think probably David Bone, if he's still there online, to Vienna, I saw some of his material in Vienna. In Paris, there's some of the Nopcsa material. Buffetot actually wrote a paper on that in the last 10 years. There's stuff all over the place.
It kind of sounds as if, you know, if you leave, you just leave your stuff behind somewhere, it'll turn up somewhere, you know.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, interesting that there's material in different places. We do have one or two people in HOGG who have connections with Hungary and Budapest, so it might be that they take up some of the interest there. My question, if I may, I'm going to chip in with mine. You showed a very interesting diagram, and I'm not sure which of his publications it was, but it was the diagram that showed it was a form of subduction, is what you call it, because
Yep.
he's clearly a believer. Possibly,
They're in the third set.
obviously, let's just see if we can get some people muted. I see. Obviously, from his conviction about continental drift, which came from probably from his paleontological work and understanding that he'd got an island.
Yep.
How could that actually be? But what was interesting is his reconstruction, which, as you suggest, is somewhat geosynclinal, which was very early on. I'm not sure the date of that, certainly for the 1920s, again, quite early on. And I wondered if he'd seen the earliest reconstruction I can know of which gives hints of subduction, is Arthur Holmes's work. And I wondered if he'd come across that, or whether he was basing it on some form of geosynclinal theory. I don't know if you know about that, but I don't know, what's the publication?
Sorry, Duncan, I can't remember from the top of my head.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll look it up.
I'll try and look it up, and if I find it, I can let you know. There's Mark who has a question, I believe.
Yeah, Mark Keatley. Go ahead. You'll have to unmute. Sorry, Mark. Just unmute yourself when you talk. Toolbar. Has he unmuted himself?
Yeah.
Seems to have frozen himself. Oh, sorry. He's.
Maybe we could take David while Mark is unmuting.
Next one, David. Is anybody else? Who've we got? Tom Frisch. Yeah, would you like to speak? You come in.
Yes, I was wondering how Nopcsa's paleontological work is regarded. Is it considered quite accurate and valuable, or what?
There is some very deep insights and some disasters. Because he was such a kind of he was very full of himself, and whatever he believed he was right. So in some instances he got it completely wrong, and it doesn't make sense whatsoever. In some, he was way ahead of his time, and that's the bit that is actually frustrating when you go through his work. When you study someone and you're trying to look at their biography, you try to pretty much make them a hero. Nopcsa was both a hero and a counter-hero, really. He got some things terribly wrong, but some he got tremendously, and he was very early on that. I mean, the fact that he would actually cut bones open and look inside to see how dinosaurs grew was way ahead of its time.
It strikes me he lived on the scientific edge, trying to get insights, and of course that will inevitably produce some insights, and on other occasions spectacularly wrong. Quite
yes.
And that's a sort of a story which repeats itself throughout history in various ways. You could look at Buckland that way, for example. However,
yes.
Next, John Milsom and then Dominic.
Not a geological question, but I was just wondering where that interesting family tree of all the Albanian tribes came from.
I'm trying to think now. It was a paper that was published in some kind of ethnological journal about Albanian albanology. I could dig that out if you like.
I'd be very grateful. I'd love to see it.
Thank you. Mark Keatley has messaged his question. He says his microphone's not working, unfortunately, but his question was, if Nopcsa were alive today, where would he be working, do you think?
He wasn't a person who would actually work at a place. He would actually go wherever he felt he would like to be. I think he would have liked to go to the States. He had various plans to travel to the States and actually never made it. He did travel to Egypt, among other things. But of all his travels, he would actually make the decision himself as to what his new discovery would be, of how he would go about a particular thing. He was extremely independent and wasn't kind of a person who would actually, but also in fairness, he was a big fan of the Natural History Museum, or the BM as it was called at the time. He just loved it. He looked very much down on the French and the Greeks. For me, being Greek is a bit of an issue, but here you go.
Right. Interesting. Was there a reason why he looked down on the French and Greeks? I mean, do you know?
Casual racism was considered normal at this time, so I suspect it was part of the whole aristocratic thing. I don't know. As for the Greeks, yes, I suspect it's to do with Albanian politics.
Okay.
the Greek government at the time was obviously involved, as all Balkan governments, into putting their fingers in Albania, and I suspect he wanted them out.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Fascinating. Any more questions or comments? Okay, I'm just looking around, casting around, see if we've got anybody. Tom Frisch again.
Yeah, I was wondering, was he? It sounds like Nopcsa was a homosexual. Can you comment on that?
Oh yes, most definitely. No question about it. And what's interesting about it is that he lived it very openly, which at the time was very radical. He wouldn't call his companion his lover or anything of the kind. He would call him his secretary or his servant, which is one way of looking at it. But at the time, it was rather unusual, and you'd expect that a number of all these famous people he dealt with knew quite well that he was traveling with his companion. And he was very much close to Doda. They spent close to 30 years together. It was pretty much a marriage, which at the time is rather unusual. So here you go. Yes.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, well, that's. I mean,
one additional point: the facts that he had a male lover is one of these things that is an issue, particularly in former communist countries. A number of people in Albania are happy to consider him as a father of the country, blah 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 blah. But when it comes to his homosexuality, they just deny it. Same thing in Romania, and to some extent in Hungary. In my view, there's no question. But here you go.
Just one thing that strikes me. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I mean, you couldn't. In one sense, you almost couldn't make this up. I wonder if anybody has attempted to dramatize or create a film. I know we've had Indiana Jones, but one wonders whether anybody's attempted to do that. I take it there's no proper biography of him.
There is a German biography of him, and there's a Hungarian biography of him. There was a short biography that was written by what's the guy's name? Name escapes me now. Robert Elsie, who's a Canadian. But in terms of a whole biography, these are the two, Robo and the Hungarian one. In terms of a film, there has been a film done in Albania called Doda, and you can find it on YouTube. Although there are times when it's free, and there are times where you have to pay for it to get it. So I watched it when it was free. I don't know at this point whether it's free or not. It's fairly well made. It's obviously about the relationship of two people and how it's more of a documentary about this filmmaker actually trying to look up what happened to Doda and Nopcsa, and actually visiting the Vienna cemetery to try and find where they'd be buried and around the story of the cinema director kind of trying to dig them out.
Fascinating. I think we're probably coming towards the end, and so in terms of wrapping up, I mean, on that last point, really, I hope with the information that you've found that perhaps you've got enough information to write a biography, or certainly write something in the English language, because without a doubt, from the sorts of things that you described, people would be absolutely fascinated, and it would probably do a great deal for paleontological and geological sciences also.
I have started, to be honest. It's a difficult job, and I'm terribly lazy. But yes, I have started, and I'd love to finish it. Yes.
Well, all power to your writing wrist for writing that. The second thing, which I think it's been a tremendous stimulation, certainly to me, to go and look up some of his work and try and read around a little bit in terms of some of the things that he was producing. Not least, not only his paleontological work, but his mapping work, the first geological map of Albania, which I found fascinating also. So it remains me to say thank you very much on behalf of the History of Geology group for such a fascinating insight into what was clearly a brilliant and mercurial mind and personality. And in some ways, that his work is perhaps not as well recognised as it seems to be deserved to be. So thank you very much indeed, and I'll bid you good afternoon, as I will also to everybody else.